John Greenleaf Whittier as our starting here. You know, there's this kind of notion that is being spread among the media and just, you know, people in general who are not all that familiar with the history of the United States, that this phenomena of, you know, right-wing Proud Boys and crazy white people going nuts in airports and trashing women in general and going after minorities and you know, all this kind of stuff is new in politics. And indeed, you know, since 2015, when Donald Trump started his racist campaign for president, trashing women, Hillary Clinton in particular, but, you know, being accused of rape and sexual assault of over 20 women, this self-entitled, whining, preening, racist so-called straight talk that Trump was started engaging in 2015. Between then and now, hate crimes and violence against minorities and against women have increased across the United States by about 20%, 19.5% is the last study. Meanwhile, you've got these so-called conservatives who've created this watch list of college professors suspected. In fact, they call it the watch list. There's a link to it in my article today on HartmannReport.com. Let me see if I can pull up the URL for the watch list. Yeah, it's professorwatchlist.org if you want to check it out. So, you know, it's the new McCarthyism, right? But people think, oh, it's like McCarthy. And then, you know, they're corrupting Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema and the entire GOP, these right-wing billionaires. And these people are showing up at school boards and threatening teachers and threatening school boards and threatening election officials all across the country. And everybody is like, oh, this is like, is he reinventing German Nazism, or is this something that he got from Roy Cohn and Roger Stone? And my answer is, well, yeah, but this goes back a long way. I mean, you know, today's Proud Boys are just what they called the churchmen of New England in the 1700s. They called the Klan riders in the 1800s. Joe McCarthy called them his fervent followers in the 1950s. You know, the so-called conservative, anti-critical race theory politicians, they're just today's versions of John C. Calhoun, who was fronting for the so-called plantation, the torture camp owners in the mid-1800s. And historically, these guys lose, but they do enormous damage to our country every time they come to power. And we have to learn from that. I mean, the Catholic Church went after Copernicus and then promoted crusades and pogroms against Muslims and Jews, authoritarians throughout history, typically motivated by deep-seated fears and ignorance, hate science, hate egalitarian values, and hate those who think or look differently from them. Ben Franklin was born in Massachusetts. He left Massachusetts when he was 16. He wrote about it in his first autobiography. It was because in Massachusetts, you had to tithe to the church. And every Sunday they came around, and if you weren't in church, they'd come to your house and whip you. I mean, today, right now, the second largest cause of misinformation and lies about everything from Donald Trump to COVID, you know, right behind social media, Facebook and their friends, right behind that, the second largest, vehicle for promoting these lies are TV preachers and churches and YouTube preachers. I mean, this is, and I quote at length in my piece over at HartmannReport.com today, John Greenleaf Whittier's poem, How the Women Went from Dover. And I won't read the whole poem to you. In fact, I won't read any more of it to you. But basically, it's the story of these three young women who defied a local church leader who was also the political leader of this little town in New Hampshire called Dover. And it was a brutal winter. And he ordered them stripped naked, these three young women, tied to the back of a cart and dragged through 11 towns, where in each town they were given 10 lashes, covering the snow with their blood, because they dared stand up to basically male religious power, anti-science. Their crime was that they were Quakers in a Congregationalist town or a Presbyterian town, whatever it was. It was a right-wing Protestant town, and the Quakers are believers in peace. and they're tolerant of others. In other words, they were liberals, for God's sake. And back then we had whipping and beating and stoning and hanging and nailing and being pilloried and dragging and burning and branding and all these other techniques. And, you know, if Trump and his boys could bring it back, if they get power again, they'll try to bring back probably half of those things. But this is not new. Instead of public whippings to humiliate their enemies, they use social media. Truck caravans with semi-automatic weapons and giant flags. They pick fights in airports and public parks. Instead of denying that the earth goes around the sun, now they're denying the dangers of COVID and global warming. Instead of closing schools, they force teachers to expose themselves to disease and harass and threaten them if they dare teach actual science and the actual history, racial history of the United States. Instead of requiring the payment of church taxes to vote, as they did in Massachusetts and New Hampshire back in the day, they now just, you know, have these elaborate ways that you have to prove your citizenship, and they regularly purge what they refer to as undesirable people from voting rolls with no consequence at all. Supreme Court, wink and a nod, no problem. From Ben Franklin's time until today, every generation of Americans have confronted right-wing authoritarians who are bent on maintaining violent white male supremacy using these twin levers of religious fanaticism and concentrated wealth. And frankly, it's probably beyond human nature to stop this from happening again, but we need to realize that what's going on is nothing new. This has been around for a long, long time. It has to do with authoritarian, mostly men, mostly white men, mostly Christian white men, but it has played out in other, you know, it's playing out right now in the Middle East with authoritarian Muslim men. And, you know, you've got now ISIS-K in Afghanistan.